coffee shop, movie theater, streaming service, phone plan, software subscription. Almost every single time a business gives you three options to choose from, you will feel a strong, almost automatic pull toward the one in the middle. Not the cheapest, not the most expensive, the one sitting right there in between. And here's what should genuinely bother you about that. Businesses know this happens so reliably that they don't just offer three options by accident. They frequently build the entire pricing menu specifically around making sure the middle one is the one you were always going to pick. So the real question this video is actually about isn't why do you like the middle option? It's why do so many completely unrelated industries all converge on the exact same three-option structure, over and over, as if they'd all read the same secret playbook. This isn't a vague impression. It's one of the most replicated findings in behavioral economics, with real experimental data behind it. Researchers Amos Tversky and Eldar Simonson published foundational work on what's now called the compromise effect, showing that when people choose between options that vary along a single dimension, like price and quality, adding a third, more extreme option dramatically shifts preference toward the option now sitting in the middle. In one of the most cited demonstrations of this effect, a famous case study involving a breadmaker company found that simply adding a more expensive third model to their lineup significantly increased sales of the mid-priced model, even though the new expensive option itself barely sold at all. The expensive option wasn't there to be bought. It was there to change what the middle meant. Now, the easy explanation is people just don't want to seem cheap and don't want to overspend, so the middle feels safe. And that's true, as far as it goes. But that explanation alone doesn't fully hold up, because if it were just about avoiding two extremes equally, you'd expect the effect to work the same way regardless of how those extremes were positioned. It doesn't. Change where the cheap option sits, or how the expensive option is described, and you can shift which choice feels like the safe middle without touching the actual middle option's price or features at all. Which means something far more precise than simple risk aversion is actually steering this. The middle option isn't inherently attractive. It's made to look attractive by everything positioned around it. Here's the piece almost nobody explains clearly. Your brain is genuinely bad at judging the absolute value of something in isolation. Is $9 a fair price for a cup of coffee? Most people honestly don't know on its own. What your brain is actually very good at is relative comparison, judging whether one thing is better or worse than the thing right next to it. Businesses that understand this stop trying to convince you a single price is fair in isolation because that's a genuinely hard sell. Instead, they build you a small, deliberate comparison set and let your own brain's relative judgment machinery do the persuading for them. Which means the cheapest option on a three-tier menu is very often not actually meant to be bought by very many people at all. Its real job is to make the middle option look generous by comparison. And the most expensive option is very often not meant to be bought by many people either. Its real job is to make the middle option look reasonably priced by comparison from the opposite direction at the exact same time. And this is where it gets genuinely more calculated than most people assume, because pricing teams don't just guess at where to place those two outer options. There's real, structured methodology behind exactly how far apart to space three tiers and exactly what features to include or withhold at each level, specifically engineered to funnel attention toward one predetermined target. Pricing and product teams frequently use a technique sometimes called decoy pricing or asymmetric dominance, where one of the outer options is deliberately made just slightly worse, in some specific way, than the middle option, often for barely less money, or sometimes for exactly the same money. When a customer sees an option that's clearly, obviously inferior to another option at a similar price, it doesn't just get ignored. It actively makes the option it's being compared against look like the clearly smarter choice, even to shoppers who never consciously register the inferior option's existence at all. Which raises the real question this video is actually about. How much does this actually move the needle on what people buy in real, measured numbers? Here's the mechanism, named plainly. It's called the decoy effect, a well-documented subtype of the broader compromise effect. And one of the most famous real-world demonstrations of it came from an economist studying subscription pricing for a well-known magazine. The company offered a web-only subscription for a lower price and a print plus web subscription for a notably higher price. When researchers added a third option, a print-only subscription priced almost identically to the print plus web bundle. Something remarkable happened. Almost nobody chose the print-only option. But its mere presence, sitting there looking clearly inferior to the print plus web bundle at a similar price, dramatically increased how many people chose the higher-priced bundle compared to when that decoy option wasn't offered at all. So the reframe here is this: that unpopular option nobody picks isn't a mistake or a wasted line on the pricing page. It's doing real, measurable work every single time someone glances at the menu, whether or not they ever consciously notice it, let alone choose it. Its entire value to the company comes from existing, not from being purchased. And once you see it this way, you start noticing this exact three-tier structure everywhere, deployed with real precision. Software companies routinely offer a basic, pro, and enterprise tier, where the enterprise tier's actual specifics are often vague or require "contact us" pricing, because its real job isn't to be purchased by most visitors. It's to make the pro tier look like the obviously complete, reasonable choice by comparison. Coffee shops offer small, medium, and large specifically because the price gap between medium and large is usually disproportionately small compared to the gap between small and medium, nudging you toward the larger, higher margin option that suddenly looks like the better value. So here's the number. In multiple published pricing experiments testing the decoy effect directly, researchers have documented preference shifts toward the intended target option ranging from a meaningful minority of respondents all the way up to the clear majority, depending on how the decoy was positioned. With several well-known studies showing the addition of a single well-placed decoy option shifting overall preference by numbers commonly cited in the range of 10 to 20 percentage points toward the option the seller actually wanted chosen. That's an enormous behavioral shift, generated entirely by adding one extra listed option that, on its own, almost nobody ever actually buys. Now, if a 10 to 20 point shift from one extra option sounds significant, wait until you see what happens when companies stop using just one decoy and instead build out an entire deliberate architecture of comparisons across 4, 5, or even more tiers at once. Because the more sophisticated version of this isn't just about nudging you toward the middle. It's about controlling which comparison your brain makes first, and that turns out to matter more than almost anything else on the page. Here's the layer most people miss entirely. It's not just which options exist. It's the order they're presented in. Multiple studies on pricing page design have found that the order in which tiers are displayed measurably changes which one people choose, even when the actual prices and features stay completely identical. Presenting the highest priced option first, before the customer has anchored on a lower number, tends to make every subsequent option look more reasonable by comparison. Because the first number you see quietly sets the scale your brain uses to judge everything that follows. Which means pricing pages aren't just choosing which 3 or 4 numbers to display. They're choosing a sequence, deliberately engineered to control the very first anchor your brain locks onto before you've made a single conscious comparison. The middle option doesn't just benefit from what's sitting on either side of it. It benefits from the specific order your eyes were guided to encounter all three. Here's why this matters beyond just pricing pages specifically. This same underlying structure, a deliberately weak or extreme option existing specifically to reshape what a reasonable middle looks like, shows up across a huge range of decisions you make that have nothing to do with online subscriptions at all. Restaurant wine lists often feature one very expensive bottle near the top, not because the restaurant expects to sell much of it, but because its presence makes the second most expensive bottle look like a moderate, sensible choice by comparison. Real estate agents sometimes show a client one deliberately overpriced or flawed property early in a search, specifically to reset what feels like a reasonable price for everything shown afterward. And negotiators use a closely related version of this same principle constantly, sometimes called anchoring, opening with a deliberately high or extreme initial number specifically because it resets the entire range the other person will consider reasonable for the rest of the conversation, even if that opening number is never seriously expected to be accepted at all. The three-tier pricing menu and the aggressive opening offer in a negotiation are, structurally, doing the exact same psychological job, reshaping your sense of the middle before you've consciously realized comparison has even started. And this is where the story gets genuinely counterintuitive. because it means the option that feels like your own free, independent choice, the one you land on after weighing the alternatives yourself, was very often the specific outcome the entire menu was engineered to produce from the very beginning. The feeling of comparing and deciding is real. The set of things you were given to compare against almost never was neutral. So here's the full mechanism, all the way through. Your brain struggles to judge absolute value but is genuinely good at relative comparison. So businesses stop trying to convince you a single price is fair and instead build you a small, deliberate set of options to compare against each other. A cheap option gets included specifically to make the middle look generous. An expensive option gets included specifically to make the middle look reasonable. A decoy option, nearly identical in price to the intended target but clearly weaker, gets included specifically to make that target look like the obviously smart choice. And the entire sequence gets ordered deliberately, because the very first number you see quietly sets the scale for every comparison that follows. None of it requires lying to you about a single price. It only requires carefully choosing what gets placed beside the truth. Which leaves an interesting question worth sitting with. As more purchasing decisions move to interfaces that can be personalized in real time, a streaming service that can show you a different decoy tier than it shows someone else, based on your own individual browsing and spending history. Does the compromise effect stop being a shared psychological quirk everyone experiences roughly the same way, and start becoming something closer to a personalized menu, quietly rebuilt around each individual person's specific price sensitivity? This is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to unpack. Not the surface-level feeling that the middle option feels right, but the precise, deliberately engineered architecture of comparison sitting quietly underneath that feeling, built specifically so it would show up right on schedule. If you want to keep seeing the real mechanics behind the prices, menus, and choices you make every day, subscribe. Because next up is a company most people think makes its money selling burgers, when the real, much stranger engine underneath it is something almost nobody guesses correctly on the first try. Next time you find yourself instinctively reaching for the option in the middle, you're not making an independent choice. You're completing a comparison that was very carefully built from both directions at once, specifically to end exactly where you just landed.